Asylum seekers,
legal immigrants,
boat people,
refugees.
These are a few terms thrown around by the media to describe people who come to Australia without a valid visa or passport. They are terms that are so often interchanged you might think they all mean the same thing. Well, you'd be wrong. Refugee is a legal term that is actually much more complicated than most people, even journalists, know. So, what does it mean? How can you tell if someone's a refugee? Let me give you a rundown. The key international definition of refugee can be found in the 1951 Refugee Convention. This was an international treaty that the UN introduced and which Australia signed in 1954. Article 1A2 of the Convention defines a refugee as someone who has fled their own country because they fear persecution there. This fear needs to be well founded, and specifically, the persecution must relate to one of four things: race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion. If the persecution falls outside these categories, you won't be classified as a refugee. And if you are fleeing your country for reasons other than persecution, maybe you're trying to escape family violence, civil war, famine, or other natural causes, you also won't be classified as a refugee. You might be starting to think the definition of refugee is pretty restrictive, and it is. Plenty of critics say the convention needs to be revised to include other reasons why people might flee their home country.
Some people think that the international refugee definition is too narrow because it requires people to have a well-founded fear of persecution, but not just for persecution's sake alone, but because it's linked to their political opinion or their race or nationality and so on. Similarly, if you're fleeing from a disaster or the impacts of climate change, it's going to be pretty difficult to bring yourself within the refugee definition. So there are actually more people displaced today by disasters than there are by conflict. 61% versus 39%.
Consider this situation. Amir is a young man fleeing violence in Syria who makes the treacherous journey across the Mediterranean to Greece. There, he finds crowded facilities and no job opportunities as the area is overflowing with other asylum seekers. He hears that he could get a decent job and apartment elsewhere in Europe, so he leaves Greece and he travels to Sweden. Is he now a migrant or a refugee? Unfortunately, there's no simple answer. It's up to each individual country to determine whether a person seeking asylum should be afforded refugee status and protection. Many countries keep asylum seekers in camps while their refugee applications are being considered. Australia has a policy of processing these refugees in places like Nauru and Papua New Guinea, which has come under fire in the media and internationally.
So there's a couple of competing principles at play here. One is states do have the authority to refuse entry to people who try to come to the country illegally, but under refugee law there is also a responsibility not to return people to countries where they fear persecution or torture or death. Currently, Australia has reached a compromise where it is refusing entry to people without authority to enter Australia, but rather than returning them to the country where they fear persecution, is taking them to third countries for them to be processed as refugees.
The UN estimates that 68.5 million people were forced to flee their homes in 2017. And to put that in perspective, it means one person is forcibly displaced every 2 seconds around the world. But if you can't call them a refugee, what is the correct term? Displaced person is the overarching word used to describe anyone who has been forced to leave their home due to war, violence, political strife, or natural disasters like floods. Use that term if you're in doubt. An asylum seeker is someone seeking refugee protection in the country they've arrived, but that country has yet to determine whether they fit the definition of refugee. An illegal immigrant is someone who has had their refugee application or other visa application rejected, and they remain in the country without a valid visa. So, asylum seekers who arrive in Australia are not illegal immigrants, and they're not doing anything illegal. They do have rights under international law to enter a country to seek protection as a refugee. And if they fit the definition, they have a right to stay. The Australian Human Rights Commission has found that an average 90% of asylum seekers who arrive in Australia are ultimately found to be refugees.